But I think we should getting started now. Yep, good. So hello everybody, nice to see you today. Welcome to our monthly developer day. And today we continue covering topics that were requested by developer community members. And we have two great topics for today talks. First is demo on documenting and testing of REST API calls presented by Danny, application developer at Winfo. And the second one is application testing presented by Pravin Barton, senior application developer at InterSystems. Thank you, Danny and Pravin, for speaking for us today. So a little bit of organizational moments here. So we will have time for question and discussions as we usually do. Please feel free to type your questions. Type your questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute after the demo and ask your question loud. We always encourage you to, get more interactions, share your experience, share links, anything helpful for each other in the chat. And this roundtable is recorded. It will be published later on developer community and Global Masters. So that's it. I'm ready to pass the floor now for the first speaker, to Danny, who have been our partner and developer community member for like many years. How many, Danny?
I have no idea.
That's
From the first day it was invented.
Okay, I've stopped sharing my screen so you can take the floor.
Okay, so I will promise I will not show too much slides and do a demo. Hello everybody, I'm Danny. I will not pronounce my last name. You will not remember it anyway. Okay. So I hope you can all see my screen and all in Technicolor.
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Okay. So what we did is when we make code for REST calls, we start to make some comments in methods that we call, and those comments are used by the tool I wrote to generate documentation for it. Sorry if I jump directly into the code, but so for example, you see here that this method that is called by a REST call, that it expects a query parameter last name, and for example, the response is going to be an array, and it's pointing to this method for the let's say the documentation of the response of the method. So the goal is that I put all these comments, and that from these comments automatically my documentation is generated. So it seems that this works without PowerPoint. You can all see this.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so okay, I don't need this screen. I need the real Swagger. This one. So you see that this, I can show you the file that's generated. Maybe you don't want to see it, but where can I? So this is a file that's generated by all that documentation, and that's not really interesting, but it's giving it to the Swagger UI, and so you can just test your REST call like this. For example, if you do a post, it will show this this documentation that you saw here in the method, this thing here. So this is given to Swear, so you know if you need to do a post, what kind of properties you need to fill in. So that was my first step, be able to generate a file that Swagger can use, and so the client developers can test the REST API. But this was just one step. What I really wanted to do is to make a tool that can automate all these tests, because you can try to run this by executing it, and then you can see the response. But this should be able to well, you should be able to automate all this, so you don't have to test this every time. So I wanted to make a tool where you can give a kind of scenario where I can say, okay, first I want to do a post of a patient, then I will do a put to change something of the patient, then I will get the patient to check if the patient is there, and maybe then I want to delete it. So I want to make a script to run all this, and at the end of the script I want to roll back every operation, so nothing is kept in my database, because else every day it will generate stuff that I don't need. So that was the second, and then I made this program which I called API stories. Just have to log in. First of all, it gives me an overview of what kind of tests are in red, but I will maybe first show you this. So here I can, in fact, create a kind of scenario to test the patients. For example, first I want to call this REST API to get all the patients. Then I'm going to create a patient. I want to update them, one, retrieve, etc. So, for example, to get a patient, I just use this API. I don't give any parameters. But for example, to create a patient, I can here just put the body that I want to post. And if I click here on the play button, the scenario will be, all the REST calls will be called one by one. And what is also nice is that you can use the output of one REST call to use as the input for the next one. For example, if you do a post of a patient, you'll see I get an ID back, and I want to use this ID for my get or my put to update this record. So in the next call, I use this kind of syntax, context ID, which means that every REST call, everything I get back from each REST call will be put in some kind of object, which I call context, and you can get the properties out of it to use as parameters for your next calls. So in that way, you can chain a lot of REST APIs one by one and use the output of one to the input for the next one. And so you can create your own scenario to do all these REST calls. So for example, one thing I test is if the documentation says that I expect a first name and a last name here in my code. If, for example, I type something wrong and I use a wrong property name, if I compile this one, and then if I run the whole scenario again, you will see that a bunch of API calls now fail because, well, we get a last name XXX as property, and we don't expect it. So he says there's an error in the output. The same thing with the status. You can also say for each REST call what kind of status you expect that REST call will give back. So if this is not the HTTP status that it will return, you will also get an error. So in that way, all this can be run automatically every night. And every time somebody changes the code, well, we can see. So if I correct this again, and I run it again, it's now fine. So the goal of this is when he's done with doing this whole scenario, all these calls in one scenario are done in one big transaction. So I can roll back the transaction at the end. Now the problem is, of course, how can you run all the REST calls in one transaction? Because normally a REST call is done in another process. So what I do is, instead of doing the call through HTTP, I call directly the method that's in fact used here in the routing. So I directly call this method in the same transaction and not using, let's say, the HTTP call. But I can say, okay, you need to do the HTTP calls if you really want to, but then it will not be done in the same transaction. So this is a bit in an overview what I do. I can also run it in terminal. Maybe I can show it as well. So if I just run it in terminal, it's doing the same thing, and this is running all the tests. So not only this scenario, but all my scenarios. And in this way, I can run this every night in a task manager, and mail me the results if they are not good. So it's so maybe it's time to look at the questions. Yeah, so one of the questions is, how do you store the results of the test after you roll back? Because of course, the rollback removes everything, also whatever logs you would want to do. So I have a switch for that. No, sorry, I want to go here. I have here a switch keep logs that will map the data, the logging data, to another the temporary database, temporary namespace, so that everything you save in the temp namespace is not rolled back because it's not journaled. So I can well, after the rollback, I will set this data back into the main database, so it's not in the rollback. So yeah, I do a little trick to not roll back all my test and logging data, because if something goes wrong, you maybe don't want to keep the data, but you want to keep the logs. Yeah, so now it's a tool that I wrote just for one customer, and I think it would be nice if I can put this on the community, so you can try that as well. But for me to do it, I have to, well, remove some dependency that I now use for that customer. So for example, the login screen is logging in their system, so I need to remove that so you can use that on your system. So yeah, if there is a need for it, if people think that it's a good idea to publish it, I can do some effort to do that. It's made, the UI is made in Vue. It's also using REST calls. and it can run on Cache or Iris. The only thing you really need to do is you have to make some comments. So for example, this comment or this comment is used, and the comments here are used, these comments are used, and let's say the description of the response, but also the description of the request is done like this. So these are the comments you need to put in your code. For the rest, it will just follow the routes to your method. So the rest is internal. Yeah, so that I think was my demo. Sorry that I didn't show the slides because now I just dove right into the demo without explaining a little bit the context. So maybe another question here. You said you're on several sites. Yeah, so the tool is in fact used on several customers. In fact, one customer paid for it, and the other customers can just use it. So yeah, it can run in fact on any Cache or Iris system. It only needs REST, so there's no really, except over the logging in, no really dependency. So I think I should be able to publish it so you can use it. Okay, I think that's about it. I don't know if there are other questions.
I guess we're receiving a very nice feedback from people. Any questions, please feel free to unmute and ask. And I believe we do have requests for publishing that on developer community.
Yeah, I will make a little effort and publish it. Though I need to ask first that customer that I can publish this code because they paid for it. So, but normally it will not be a problem because if it's in the community and you find a bug, you can also help me. Okay, sorry for the bad start, but I hope you got something out of this demo.
Thank you so much, Danny. That was a bumpy start, but thank you for making it anyway. And yeah, hopefully we'll find some time and we'll make sure to award some points on Global Masters for your time and effort there for like publishing article. And there was an idea to even make a article contest for that. I'll make sure to pass this idea to Anastasia. Yeah, thank you, guys. All right, let's move to the second part. Pravin, how is your laptop now?
Sorry about that. I think I'm back. I'm gonna. Thank you, Danny, by the way, for that great presentation. I guess I can kind of resume mine. I'm gonna avoid sharing video in the hopes that helps with the technical issues, but I'll share my screen again. So I'm seeing the same host disabled participant screen sharing. You might need to add me again.
Vladimir, can you please share a co-host for Pravin? Okay, now you should be able to share.
All right. Great. So when we were interrupted by a blue screen of death, I was showing this Cypress test, which just tests a very simple test case on our application. It's a few lines of codes that just verifies that there are expected cards on a page after login. I opened up Cypress. I have it running on my laptop, and I'm gonna run it to show what running this test actually looks like. So I can choose a browser. I typically go with the default because usually there's not too much browser specific differences. And here we have a list of our specifications. The one we were looking at before is, what was it? Let me switch back to that. Select service, customer service selection. When we run this test, it actually runs all of those commands in a browser, pretty much identically to how a user would actually be loading the application in a browser. So we see it performing actions like you would expect a user to do, just loading the page. That went really quickly because it's a machine and it can click faster than we can. But you can browse back through the results, see screenshots at every stage. Basically, we're loading the page. We have a bunch of asserts that various elements exist on the page. And then we're actually clicking into each of these cards and making sure that it takes us to the expected URL. So this test is assuming that we're already logged in as a authenticated user, as a user that has access to each of these things. We accomplished that in the test by calling a special method that we defined in our support. Since we're not actually testing login, we just want to do the minimum possible to give us an authenticated session. So that looks like, I can go to the method definition. We're just making a post request to our login page, giving it a username and password. And that's something that happens in our test before each of them. I can try changing the test to show you what a failure looks like. So for example, if we expect the title of one of the cards to be something different than it actually is, and go back to here, you'll see I saved the test and it automatically reruns it. And we should see a failure. So here it is, it's timing out. It's looking for an item that says evaluation license not real. And there's some timeout associated with it because not everything loads synchronously in a browser. But once it reaches this timeout, it'll realize, no, this thing will never exist. And we'll get a nice failure, which says we broke something. All right. So this is the simplest possible test. You're basically just asserting that some elements are there on the page. But of course, there are going to be more complicated ones. One of the challenging things we found with end-to-end testing is when there is some prerequisites needed for the test that isn't just part of the workflow. Some data needs to exist or your account needs to be authorized for something. In this test, we're assuming that we have a test account that's already authorized for all that we need. But if that account goes away for some reason, our test would break. So to make the test more durable, we may not want to connect to the database directly and seed an account with the appropriate credentials and authorization. So the way we do that for some of our other tests is by calling a special REST API that we create. Since we're already creating a bunch of REST APIs to drive our application behavior, it's pretty simple to just create a new REST API that sets up the test data that we need. And that only exists on our test system. Let me show an example of one of those methods that seeds test data. Kind of lost all of my context when my computer crashed, but I can find some things. So here's one. We have these early access programs on this page. And I think pretty much everybody is enabled for at least one, but most people are not. And these early access programs kind of change, they get deprecated, they come in. So since that's something that changes a lot, we don't want to update our test every time that data changes. So we use a seeding service to seed the data with some test data we can test on. And what that looks like here is pretty simple. We're just making a request against our seeding data endpoint that says, I'm going to enable this user for this EAP, this early access program. And there's some object script code in the back end that'll create the program if it does not already exist and enable the user for it. Cypress also gives you another option, which is that instead of seeding the database with actual data, you can stub calls to APIs on the server. So this is basically telling the browser that when it's making some HTTP request, don't do that, and instead call some method that you define in the test. This is really handy for keeping your tests more focused on what you care about, which makes them less brittle, they're less likely to break. But of course, if you stub everything, then you don't have an end-to-end test anymore. So you have to find your own balance. Here's a method that uses some of that stubbing instead of calling an actual data service to set up actual data. It basically says intercept calls to this endpoint and modify the response somehow. So this is basically saying we want to pretend you're not allowed any access to early access programs. So we'll just intercept this endpoint and modify the data to say your early access is not allowed. All right. So we've covered some of the basics of like what we're using with end-to-end testing, seeding data and stubbing. We haven't really covered running those tests automatically, which is something hopefully you do. So there's not much point in running all these or having all these automatic tests if you're not running them regularly. So there's just a ton of different ways that you can integrate these tests into a continuous integration pipeline. We have something set up really nicely that whenever you're checking in some code, it'll automatically kick off a build. It'll run out all of these tests against a test system. And that means a few minutes after you do a check-in, you'll get an email saying you broke this test. That's really helpful. It's helped us catch a lot of bugs before they go live. And finally, other than having it as part of a CI continuous integration pipeline, you might just be running these tests as you develop. So you could write a test first for a feature and then write the code for it. And then you don't have to test by hand as much. That works really well if you have a relatively simple application and you have the same people working on both the front end and the back end. Realistically, I don't use that as much, but we really rely on the automated tests as part of the CI pipeline. All right, that's pretty much all I had to demo. I know that was a lot of words and not so much visual, but are there any questions or comments about test
There are a few
testing?
questions for you in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Can you see them or should I read them for you?
Yeah, I can see the questions now. Sorry, I'm not so used to Zoom, so.
Yeah.
All right. So insider question, you said majority of your web apps at ISE are Angular front end with COS back end. Is there a reason for Angular preference? I'd say the biggest deal for us is just being consistent as a team, as a company, because if there's the same framework across most or all of our web applications, then that makes it a lot easier to train new developers, jump into another project, something like that. Yeah, I can't exactly remember the reasoning of React versus Angular versus Vue, but I'm sure there's lively debates about that. Another one, can you give more details on a card and how to configure one for these tests? So a card in this context is just a UI, a special type of UI element. It's called a card because we're using Angular material, I believe, and that's basically a UI component framework. And a card is something that looks like this. It's just a box that you can click on. Some more detail about how we actually are using these with our tests. A big deal is the selectors here, which let the test like know what you're supposed to be interacting with, what you're verifying on. Here we're using just a basic selector of the ID equals this. So this is a very common, like this is the same selectors you would use in the CSS, for example, or JavaScript. So Cypress has its own mocking framework. Yep, and it's very helpful. It lets you stub. Well, we mostly use it for stubbing calls to the server because we don't want to, for our end-to-end testing, we don't want to mock like services and stuff like that. Is our CI pipeline hooked up to GitHub or GitLab? No, we're actually using Jenkins for most of our internal apps, which is, I mean, the process of setting it up is pretty similar and the pipelines are going to look pretty similar. We do have some open source projects that are using GitHub Actions for the CI pipeline, but I don't think we're doing this type of testing on any of them. And finally, does our testing landscape look like Cypress for end-to-end and internally unit test package? Yep, exactly. We have Cypress for end-to-end testing. In addition, we also have Angular's built-in unit testing framework for just basic unit testing of Angular components in the front end. We don't use that a huge amount. And then we have the %unit test, and we have a bunch of custom tooling that kind of extends that and makes it work for our flow better. All right, thank you everybody for those.
I was going to ask one more question. It was too long to type. I was just going to say, so you have many frameworks for the individual testing and everything. Is there sort of a one ring to rule them all kind of thing? Does Cypress act as that for you? Or is it still sort of a couple different packages that kind of chain together for your full landscape?
Yeah, that's a good question. In theory, Cypress could be that one ring to rule them all if we invest in it. It does do end-to-end testing. It could test everything from the perspective of the user. But I do think it's important to have both the end-to-end tests on one side of the spectrum and then the unit tests on the other side, where you have tests that are really targeted for a piece of code and then tests that are more for like a full workflow. So I think having that diversity makes us stronger as a team.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you so much. Amazing. Any more questions? All right. Well, thank you so much. We will publish the recording after a few edits to it. Thank you again, Pravin and Danny, for speaking for us today. And yeah, thank you everyone who been with us for all the bumping start until the end. I'm looking forward to meet you next month. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.